The worst day of Arthur and Eleanor's life wasn't when the doctor gave the diagnosis. It was 2 days after a funeral when their children came for everything. Arthur Hayes had been a fixture at the Houston construction firm since he was a young man, retiring technically at 68 in 2020.
Should I get you something
During
to
the
eat?
lockdown, they kept him on contract, valued for his technical expertise even with the fading vision and arthritis that plagued his hands. But by 2023, his health and his sight made the remote work impossible.
Don't worry, not
The company
now.
retired him completely, replacing his income with a meager pension.
Will be fine.
Eleanor, a senior nurse who had spent decades managing crises at the prestigious Baystar Medical Group, immediately traded her scrubs for full-time caregiving. Her days became a meticulous, loving cycle of medication timing, specialized meals, and gentle encouragement for Arthur. Their eldest son, Ethan, suggested the move 3 years ago, a temporary solution that felt like salvation. "We're a family, Mom and Dad," he'd insisted. "I can handle the bills." 3 years in, the illusion of familial support shattered. Arthur's condition had worsened significantly, requiring constant care that strained Eleanor's own health. The medical debt, unmanageable even for Ethan, began to suffocate them all. 2 days after Arthur's beloved grandfather's memorial, a man whose legacy was built on hard work and community, Ethan gathered his siblings, Emily, the sharp, financially driven one, Leo, and Jessica. The conversation wasn't a discussion, it was a liquidation plan. "Look, the bills are killing us," Emily declared, her voice cold and devoid of recent grief. "We need to clear the assets." "The farm is a joke, Dad. It hasn't turned a profit since Grandpa died. I've already called a barrister. We pay off the tenant farmers and sell that land before the market drops." Leo and Jessica nodded in swift agreement, complaining about the liability. Then came the dagger. "And the bakery, Mom," Ethan said gently but firmly. "It's sentimental, but that building is worth a fortune in the city. We sell the bakery and the house. It's the only way to clear the debt and pay for Dad's long-term care." Eleanor felt the betrayal physically. That farm was Arthur's heritage, a piece of his soul. The bakery, gifted to her by her immigrant parents, was the foundation of their life, scented with every happy memory they possessed. They were selling her history and his legacy to solve a problem they had promised to help solve. That night, Arthur, his hands shaky with anger and sorrow, pulled a brittle yellowed envelope from the back of an old cigar box. It wasn't the deed to the farm, it was a single cryptic document. "Your grandfather," Arthur whispered, tears welling in his impaired eyes. "He was a quiet man. He knew family isn't always blood." The document wasn't a standard deed. It was a centuries-old land grant to a property in rural New England, Blackwood Manor, signed by a distant relative to settle a forgotten, eccentric debt. It was the only asset the children didn't know existed, a last line of defense. Eleanor understood. They would leave before they were stripped bare. They would take nothing the children valued. The next morning, they left a brief note, took the final deposit from their combined checking accounts, $100.47, and drove away in their old, rattling sedan, leaving the inheritance, the farm, the bakery, the house, to the children who valued money over their parents' dignity. Eleanor didn't cry. She just watched the emptiness. It was a silence louder than any shouting. Eleanor and Arthur Hayes, both in their early 70s, had done everything right. They raised 4 successful children, sacrificed their own dreams, and signed over their life savings to ensure their children's financial stability. Blackwood Manor was less a home and more an ice mausoleum. The windows were shattered, allowing the brutal winter air to freeze solid the remnants of water in the pipes. Inside, frost feathered the velvet drapes, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and snow. It was a literal frozen mansion. The first night, they huddled in the library, wrapped in old blankets they found in the truck, heating 2 cans of soup over a tiny camping stove. Eleanor looked at the grand, heartbreaking ruin and whispered, "We have $100, Arthur. How do we live?" The second night they set up their thermos room, the small, sealed kitchen. Eleanor notices a bizarre detail in the frozen library. Every book is covered in a uniform layer of frost, except for one small leather-bound volume perched on the mantelpiece. "Arthur," she calls out, her voice barely a whisper against the wind whistling through the broken windows. "Why isn't this one frozen?" Arthur struggles to focus his failing eyes on the title, The History of Local Barter and Exchange 1890. Tucked inside, they don't find jewels or cash, but a detailed, hand-drawn map of the manor's sprawling grounds with cryptic symbols marking specific locations. "This place isn't just a ruin, Eleanor," Arthur murmurs, a spark of the old technician returning. "It's a puzzle. And your parents' bakery taught me that the real value of a community is in what you can exchange, not what you can sell." Their $100 budget now isn't just about survival. It's about solving a mystery left by Arthur's grandfather, proving their own resilience and restoring the manor not with money, but with the very principles their children abandoned. Community and worth beyond financial assets. Arthur gently unfolds the map found inside the old barter book. It's drawn on heavy, brittle parchment, the ink faded but precise. It depicts the extensive grounds of Blackwood Manor, but not as they are now. It shows the grounds as they were a century ago, with features that have since vanished or been buried under overgrowth. The map isn't marked with X marks the spot. Instead, it uses a cryptic code based on Arthur's grandfather's old trade, archaic construction and surveying symbols. The first mark, the heart's ransom, symbol, triangle over square. The location, a small, buried stone foundation behind the overgrown, collapsed potting shed. Eleanor and Arthur dig through frozen earth. They find a buried cache of high-quality, salvaged materials. Perfect bundles of century-old, dried-out cedar shingles and several heavy bags of unused, high-lime mortar powder. Arthur realizes his grandfather, a man who saw no need to waste anything, had buried the best old stock to keep it dry. These aren't just materials. They are enough shingles to replace all the broken windows in their small, sealed kitchen zone, allowing them to finally stop using the cheap plastic sheeting. The cedar makes an incredible barter item, highly desired by local carpenters for specialty restorations. The second mark, the water's keeper, symbol, Scion Big Cirque. The location, a deep, vine-choked well near the old stone wall far from the house. The discovery, inside the well, shielded from the frost by the surrounding earth, they find the intact, heavy-duty copper tubing from the manor's original failed water heating system. The discovery is twofold. It confirms the location of the original well, a vital water source, and provides hundreds of feet of valuable, uncorroded copper. Copper is pure currency in the contracting world. It becomes their first high-value barter item to trade for specialized labor. The third mark, the baker's exchange, symbol, Mathcal B with a rising smoke curl. The location, not on the manor grounds but a reference point pointing to the nearby town's old abandoned kiln and forge. Another discovery, the map directs them to look for a fire that never went out. Arthur realizes this refers to the barter book's philosophy, value in exchange. They find a small, intact cast-iron wood-burning stove left behind in the forge, perfectly functional but covered in rust. This is the game changer. The stove is small enough for their sealed kitchen zone and gives them an efficient, controlled heat source, radically reducing their reliance on the wasteful, massive old fireplace. More importantly, it becomes a literal centerpiece for Eleanor's bartering. The map didn't give them cash. It gave them high-value inventory, materials that held intrinsic worth for the local community and contractors. They used the pristine cedar shingles to barter with a local plumber for the labor to cap the frozen pipes and run a temporary water line to their kitchen stove, now installed. They used the copper tubing to barter with a retired electrician, who needed specialty shingles for his own porch, for the labor to get a few crucial circuits working, bringing light to their sealed zone. Eleanor uses the restored wood-burning stove to start baking again. Small batches of bread and pastries, not for money but to exchange for eggs, milk, and local produce. The children had stripped them of their financial assets. The grandfather's map and the barter book empowered them to use their skills and newly found physical assets to rebuild their lives on a foundation of community exchange, proving the worth of their legacy went far beyond dollar signs. The tiny kitchen in Blackwood Manor became a hub of impossible commerce. The wood-burning stove, once a rusty relic, now hummed, radiating the first genuine warmth the manor had felt in decades. And the smell of Eleanor's baking, was her currency. Eleanor started small. Using the little stove, she baked simple, perfect sourdough loaves and dense Scottish shortbread, a recipe inherited with the bakery. She wrapped them in paper and, using the last of the $100 for gas, drove to the nearest town square, a place steeped in rural New England skepticism. The locals eyed the elderly couple with immediate suspicion. This town had seen wealthy city folk, by the manor, try to fix it and give up, leaving the community to deal with the inevitable foreclosure mess. Eleanor didn't ask for money. She simply set up a folding table with a handwritten sign, bread for timber, shortbread for scraps. The plumber's test. The first to approach was Jedediah Jed Miller, the town's chief and only plumber, a man whose face was set in perpetual skepticism. Arthur offered him the high-grade cedar shingles found in the hearth's ransom cache. Jed sneered, "Old stock. Probably rotten." Arthur, the retired senior technician, countered with a detailed, historical appraisal of the cedar's preservation method. Jed was silenced. He took enough cedar for a porch repair and, true to the exchange, capped the manor's frozen pipes and ran a temporary kitchen water line. He left with a loaf of sourdough and a grudging nod. The carpenter's bargain. A young, struggling carpenter named Maya needed the copper from the water's keeper cache to finish a specialized job. Eleanor offered her the copper in exchange for 2 days of her labor, not on the grand roof, but patching the most critical holes in the sealed kitchen zone and repairing the frame of their borrowed cot. Maya, impressed by the high quality of the copper and captivated by Eleanor's shortbread, accepted. She patched the walls with discarded, painted wood scraps she had been about to throw away. The suspicion didn't vanish overnight, but it began to melt under the warmth of the stove. The locals saw that the Hayeses weren't trying to exploit them. They were simply trying to survive using a forgotten economy. A local farmer traded a week's worth of fresh eggs and milk for Arthur's help inventorying his barn's structural issues, using his old technician's eye. A woman who ran the local library bartered heavy, antique velvet curtains, deemed too old and dark for the town hall renovation, in exchange for Eleanor knitting her a dozen pairs of heavy wool socks. These curtains soon replaced the cardboard in the manor's massive, broken windows, creating an illusion of warmth. The bartering became less about the items and more about connection. They weren't strangers anymore, they were contributing members of the community. The mansion was being restored not with dollars, but with human kindness and skill exchange. One morning, Arthur found a large, perfectly good second-hand wheelbarrow leaning against the manor's gate. Tucked into it was a note from Jed Miller. "Found this. Needs a wheel. No trade needed. Take care of that stove, Arthur. Smells too good to freeze." The manor wasn't just restored, it was adopted. The initial $100 had been spent, but the real resource, the community, was now fully engaged. The couple who were left with nothing now had the most valuable asset of all, a town full of friends. Arthur and Eleanor were no longer just surviving, they were flourishing. The sealed kitchen zone was warm, the baking was brisk, and Blackwood Manor was slowly, methodically coming back to life, not with cash but with the shared effort of the town. They had replaced the manor's massive, shattered entrance hall windows with a towering curtain of thick antique velvet, bartered for Eleanor's famous Scottish shortbread, creating an insulated barrier that held the warmth in the rear of the house. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, shattering the quiet warmth of the kitchen. Arthur struggled to answer the temporary landline, a gift from the local electrician. "Dad? It's Emily." His daughter's voice was sharp, cutting through the pleasant scent of cinnamon and rising dough. "We're finalizing the sale of the farm and the bakery. It's a mess, by the way, we're getting nowhere with the tenants. Anyway, we need to know your forwarding address for the hospice paperwork." Arthur gripped the receiver. "We won't be needing hospice, Emily." Emily laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Dad, don't be ridiculous. The doctor's reports." "We are at Blackwood Manor," Arthur stated simply. "We own the deed. We're home." A beat of silence, then a screech. "What? That dilapidated ruin? Dad, you're senile. That place is a liability. You need constant care, not a frozen squat." Arthur merely told her the cross streets and hung up. He and Eleanor knew what was coming. 3 days later, a sleek, black SUV, completely out of place against the manor's imposing, snow-dusted facade, pulled up the overgrown drive. Ethan, Emily, Leo, and Jessica emerged, dressed in expensive city coats, looking utterly disgusted by the mud, the cold, and the sheer scale of the dereliction. They stormed up the stone steps and yanked open the heavy front door, prepared for a disaster. The sight that greeted them was jarring. They were standing in the grand hall, still frozen, still vast, but changed. The floor was covered in dust sheets and sawdust, indicating work was happening. Giant velvet curtains hung where glass should have been, turning the icy hall into a dramatic, shadowed theater. "Mom. Dad." Ethan's voice was a mix of shock and rage. "What is this madness? Where are the nurses? This is illegal." Eleanor, looking healthier and calmer than she had in years, emerged from the velvet curtain leading to the back of the house. Arthur, walking slowly but steadily, followed her, carrying a kettle. "We're having tea, dear ones. Eleanor said with a serene smile that unnerved them. The kitchen is quite cozy. You look frozen, but I'm afraid our wood-burning stove only heats the one room. Emily, eyes narrowed, stalked forward, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain that blocked the way. She expected to find squalor. Instead, she saw the kitchen zone, a small, brightly lit room radiating warmth. The walls were patched with different colored scrap wood, giving it a whimsical, intentional charm. A small, black cast-iron stove glowed cherry red. The air smelled heavenly, saturated with the scent of Eleanor's fresh-baked bread. The shock was total. They looked around at the humble, beautiful ingenuity. Then their eyes fell on the people in the room. Jed Miller, the skeptical plumber, was sitting at a small table, sipping tea and discussing antique copper tubing with Arthur. Maya, the carpenter, was patching a window frame, occasionally trading banter and shortbread with Eleanor. A kindly local farmer was dropping off a crate of fresh eggs. Emily pointed at the patched walls. This is barbaric. Where are the proper materials? You're living like peasants. Arthur gently set down the kettle. His voice was strong, carrying the weight of his 70-plus years and the farm legacy Emily had dismissed. We are living on barter and goodwill, Emily, he said, fixing his gaze on his children. The same way my grandfather built this farm, the one you were so quick to sell, piece by piece helping his neighbors. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice soft but absolute. You left us with nothing. And with that nothing we bought everything that matters. We found a community that values a day's work and a shared kindness more than a barrister's legal fee. The restoration cost us $100 for the basics. Everything else was given freely. As the siblings stood there, shivering in their expensive coats, looking at the tiny, warm room and the genuine smiles of the people inside, they realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't just abandoned their parents. They had abandoned meaning. They were frozen in their wealth, while their parents had found warmth in ruin. They had come to liquidate the manor, but they left realizing they had liquidated their own humanity. The four siblings stood silent in the warm kitchen zone, their expensive leather boots sinking slightly into the worn, salvaged floorboards. They felt the judgment not from their parents' words, but from the genuine, easy laughter of the townspeople bartering nearby. Eleanor walked past them to the cooling rack. Emily, Leo, Jessica, Ethan, she said, her voice completely neutral, I want you to take a loaf of bread for your drive back. It was traded for Mrs. Hemlock's last bag of local flour. She handed each of them a heavy, perfect loaf of her famous sourdough, the very recipe that smelled of every happy memory from the bakery they had insisted on selling. As Ethan took the loaf, his eyes drifted to a small, framed photo on the repurposed wood counter. It was a picture of him, aged 5, covered in flour, standing proudly beside his mother in the brightly lit bakery kitchen. Mom, he finally choked out, his voice cracking, I'm sorry about the bakery. Eleanor didn't look at him. She looked at the cast-iron stove, which was quietly heating the room. The bakery was never just the building, dear. It was the exchange. The giving. That, she gestured to the stove, is the only bakery I need now. It gives me everything you took away. Arthur spoke then, his voice cutting through the warmth. That bread you're holding, Ethan? It didn't cost us money. It cost us kindness. Something your barrister can't buy. The siblings left Blackwood Manor quickly, the heavy loaves of bread a crushing weight in their hands. They drove away from the warmth, back toward the cold, sharp reality of their financial gains. They sold the farm, the house, and the bakery. They used the proceeds to pay off all the mounting medical debt, leaving themselves with a substantial, clean profit. But every time Ethan, Emily, Leo, or Jessica tried to eat a piece of mass-produced supermarket bread, they tasted the bitter, cold flavor of regret. They had gained money, but they had paid for it with the one thing they couldn't restore, the warmth of their parents' love. The true currency of Blackwood Manor wasn't the acreage, it was the bread. And they had all left starving. Eleanor and Arthur, side by side, stood in the main hall of the manor, looking at the towering velvet curtains blocking the cold. Arthur picked up the small worn barter book. So, old man, Eleanor said, squeezing his hand, what do you think your grandfather would say about the $100 restoration? Arthur smiled, a genuine, strong smile that erased years of pain. He'd say we overpaid. And he'd say the real restoration was getting the old heart of this community beating again. The manor wasn't just restored, it was reborn, a monument to the things money can never touch. The children had come and gone, their bitter departure confirming that Arthur and Eleanor were now truly free. The immediate crisis was over, but the work on Blackwood Manor was just beginning. The kitchen zone was functional, but the rest of the house remained a majestic, frozen ruin. The moment word spread in town about the children's cruel visit, the bartering intensified, fueled by a fierce protective local pride. The townsfolk weren't just trading labor, they were fighting a silent war against the Hayes siblings' greed. The window miracle. Jed Miller, the plumber, realized the copper he'd traded wasn't enough. He rallied the local VFW post. They didn't replace the grand hall's immense shattered windows with expensive glass. They replaced them with massive, salvaged panes of historical plexiglass sourced from a defunct local greenhouse, which they had expertly framed and sealed. It let in floods of light without losing heat. The floorboards of friendship. Maya, the carpenter, brought her entire crew, all trading their labor for enough of Eleanor's baking to feed a small army. They meticulously lifted the water-damaged, frozen floorboards in the grand hall and replaced them with repurposed wood salvaged from an old barn scheduled for demolition, giving the vast room a warm, patchwork glow. The light of exchange. The retired electrician, having received a lifetime supply of Eleanor's shortbread, spent 2 weeks installing simple, classic antique chandeliers, sourced from a church basement that was clearing out, wiring the main hall with lights powered by a small, bartered solar panel array hidden on the roof. 6 months after their $100 gamble, Arthur and Eleanor stood ready. They had invited the entire town, every person who had contributed a scrap of material, an hour of labor, or simply a loaf of their own bread, to the manor for a community Thanksgiving. The crowd gathered in the kitchen zone, buzzing with anticipation. Eleanor stepped forward and pulled aside the last heavy velvet curtain, revealing the grand hall. The sight was overwhelming. It wasn't pristine. The restored floor was a mosaic of different toned old wood. The plaster walls were patched and uneven. But the room was flooded with golden, beautiful light pouring through the massive, newly framed windows. The salvaged chandeliers cast a warm, welcoming glow. The freezing mausoleum was gone. This was now a space of magnificent human warmth. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. "It's perfect," she whispered to Arthur. Arthur, his vision struggling but his heart clear, surveyed the room. "No," he corrected gently, looking at the assembled neighbors. "It's not perfect. It's real. And it's ours." The hall filled with the sound of genuine human celebration. Arthur and Eleanor, standing amidst their community-built splendor, knew they were the richest people on earth. They hadn't restored a mansion. They had restored the true meaning of family. The story of Arthur and Eleanor Hayes is a testament to what is truly invaluable. Disowned and left with nothing by the very children they sacrificed everything for, the elderly couple used their last $100.47 not to buy materials, but to buy a chance at dignity inside the colossal, abandoned Blackwood Manor. The $100 restoration became an act of profound defiance. Guided by a grandfather's secret map and the philosophy of the old bakery, that true worth lies in exchange, Arthur and Eleanor didn't fix the mansion with money. They fixed it with kindness. They bartered antique cedar and salvaged copper for plumbing, electricity, and the labor of a small, forgotten community that was starved for connection. When their children arrived, ready to liquidate the manor and place their parents in hospice, they walked into a room radiating warmth, not from a furnace, but from a wood-burning stove fueled by community goodwill and the scent of Eleanor's perfect sourdough. They had intended to save their parents from ruin. Instead, they discovered their parents had saved themselves by finding a fortune in human empathy that their children's bank accounts could never rival. The final, painful gift of that bartered bread was a reminder to the siblings that they had sold the farm, the home, and the bakery, only to realize they had stripped their own lives of the warmth, value, and community they were trying to replace with cold, hard cash. Blackwood Manor stands today not as a monument to wealth, but as a breathtaking symbol of restored faith. A home built piece by piece with friendship, proving that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't put a price tag on. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, and share.